Do you have enough light to read, by the way?
I don't need to read. Okay. I need that down.
Welcome, everyone. It is my great pleasure to welcome a distinguished scholar and a fellow Yale graduate to AUB, Professor Jamal Elias of the University of Pennsylvania. This event is organized by the Center for Arab and Middle Eastern Studies and the Department of Arabic and Near Eastern Languages. If you want to know more about our events, there should be a paper circulating. Muhammad will be running around collecting your emails. Jamal Elias teaches courses on Islamic thought, culture and history with a focus on Sufism, Islam, and modernity, as well as visual and material culture in the Middle East and South Asia. His courses, books, and lectures often combine his wide-ranging interests and often make us reconsider perceptions and stereotypes of and in Muslim societies, past and present. He is a recipient of many grants and awards from the Guggenheim Foundation, the American Council of Learned Societies, and the Social Science Research Council, among many others. He has lectured and published broadly on history, religion, literature, and material and visual culture in the medieval and modern Islamic world. His two most recent books are On Wings of Diesel, Trucks, Identity and Culture in Pakistan, Oxford 2011, and Aisha's Cushion, Religious Art, Perception and Practice in Islam, Cambridge 2012. His latest book, Alif is for Allah, Childhood Emotions and Visual Culture, is forthcoming at the beginning of next year. I imagine Harvard University Press.
University of California.
University of California. Sorry. My students know him from his book, The Throne Carrier of God, The Life and Thought of Ala al-Dawla al-Simnani, State University of New York Press, 1995. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished speaker, Professor Jamal Elias, to AUB.
This is just sits there, and this one is closer. Well, first of all, thank you, Dr. Bilal Urfali, for this wonderful invitation, and I'd like to thank, the department and AUB and the dean who probably funds this. She nods. Okay, for this wonderful invitation. It's actually delightful to be here. I don't get to Beirut that often, and every time I come, I wonder why. But in any case, the title of my talk is Rumi, Sufism, and the Good Islam, and the subtitle was not there. It's When the Local Goes National and Global. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk a little bit, but I'm going to try and leave a lot of time for questions. Because it's kind of a talk it's got slides, it's got video, and so there'll be things that will be left out. So Sufism is often juxtaposed to other varieties of Islam for several different purposes, as a good Islam versus an imagined not good version of the religion, as a tolerant and inclusive Islam versus what is seen as intolerant and exclusionary, and as something that is local or indigenous, and therefore in some sense authentic, when you juxtapose it to an imported, non-local, and therefore inauthentic version of the religion. And this is very much, as I'm sure a lot of people in this know, this is very much a concern in a lot of Islamic societies, that there's a notion that certain countries, specifically, let's say, within the context Iran or Saudi Arabia, tend to export a packaged version of what you're supposed to be. And that gets juxtaposed to one's local, kind of what we really are, what we really were. And Sufism plays an important part in that in many societies. So what I'd like to do today is to explore this construction of religion as being in imagined categories, and do that with reference to the reputation and legacy of Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi. And to place this construction within broader attitudes towards religion as local versus global, which I see as part of a broader concern with authenticity and purity of oneself and one's community or society, as well as the one's participation in modern forms of religiosity, which is sometimes, you might sometimes call it New Age religiosity, which is, sort of the Rumi fitting into New Ageism. And I don't mean New Ageism, saying something is New Agey is often seen as a bad term, and I don't mean it in that sense, because things like that, sort of New Age, is not new. Probably as long as there have been human beings and there's been religion, human beings have been constructing meaning in their lives, in their environment, to make sense of things for themselves. So human beings have always been New Agey. There's nothing bad with that. So let me start by acknowledging that Sufism, quote unquote, as a stable mode of religiosity, is a construct, and it is no less problematic than other broadly used categories. There is no one Sufism in Turkey, in Lebanon, or in a third country. In much the same way as labels such as Sunnism or Shiism or any other religious label fail to convey the broad range of attitudes and behaviors that are displayed by people who consider themselves Sunnis or Shi'is or Catholic or whatever. For one thing, the juxtaposition of Sufism to what you might call Sharia-mindedness is simplistically false at many levels. And what I mean to say here is often when you think about, who is a Sufi and why would I want to be a Sufi? Well, for a lot of people, wanting to be a Sufi is because I don't want to be like those other kinds of Muslims, whoever I imagine them to be. So there's this kind of, often in the public imagination, there's a contrast between kind of being could I have the lights down, please? Because I'm showing slides. Thank you. You don't need to see me. You actually need to see that. This is actually very simplistic because and I don't have time to go into this kind of that Sufis and Sharia are at odds, because many pre-modern Sufi figures, prominent Sufi figures, were actually not just Sufis, but they actually had reputations as very strong scholars of what you call traditional Islamic sciences. And again, the list is long, and there's just no point in going into that. And even in the case of Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi, his job was to be a madrasa teacher. He taught basic madrasa. He taught, and his father, he inherited the job from his father, who was also a trained Sufi, who was also a madrasa teacher. So these juxtapositions of characters and identities and religious roles is just not, doesn't hold true well. So the question ultimately is, what do we mean when we use the term Sufi? And I'm using this English term intentionally because what I'm talking about doesn't exist divorced from kind of a global kind of imagination. So in the case of Turkey, Sufism means many different things. It's simultaneously today when someone says, if the Sufi, well, they might not use it, but tasawwuf, which it means simultaneously, it brings to mind the Sufi orders, tariqas, which were banned as part of the secularizing reforms of the Turkish Republic in the 1920s. And their property was taken away, which we'll come back to in a moment. But at the same time, just as it also means this particular part of a complex Turkish identity, there are many Turkish identities which were banned but continued underground, and this is one of them. A lot of the orders continue in various ways. But it's also simultaneously seen as a friendly form of individualized spirituality in which Rumi plays a central part. So, and another example I'm going to give, which I'm going to give illustratively, comparatively with Turkey, is the case of Pakistan, which is a country that I will use as an illustrative example for modern roles of Sufis, of Sufism and Sufis, where over there also it means a number of different things, especially as it gets discussed in the English-speaking and reading population, which is sort of the urban elites. And Pakistan is similar to Lebanon in that particular way, that the choice of language and who speaks English or French or whatever determines a lot about your ability to actually control information, and your status in society and decision making and so on and so forth. So in this particular case, in the Pakistani example, we'll see that the word it refers to a somewhat distilled down version of shrine culture and shrine devotion. At Sufi shrines is very big in that societies, and it emphasizes that in an aesthetic way. in a sort of as a beautiful and enjoyable, but at the same time socially abstracted. People don't talk about it in a local kind of context. And all of this happens, the kind of the imagining Sufi as this Sufism as a aesthetic and pleasurable form of kind of religious experience, it happens actually often at the expense of more historically, societally, and intellectually grounded aspects of how Sufism functions as a form of being Muslim. So let me actually move. So it's like, first of all, I don't this. So Rumi and sort of in a global Sufi in a global imagination, a global imagine. So this is, you can, if you go and you start Googling images of Rumi, you find all kinds of things. So anyway, this was my favorite one for beginning. But it's like, again, I didn't add this at the bottom. This is from an article that said, what if Rumi would have been a politician and a lawmaker? So basically the person, needless to say, was arguing that the world would be a much better place. So there's this desire to juxtapose Sufism as something beautiful and global against undesirable expressions of Islam, takes on a certain symbolic forms, such as when the followers of Rumi end up being depicted always, these whirling dervishes, which are just, they're just Mevlevis, they're followers of his order. They're always depicted in this moment of ritual, this specific kind of whirling moment of ritual. And this happens again and again and again. So they become almost a symbol. They become a symbol which becomes completely detached from their own context, by which I mean to say, they're no longer, when we see that guy in the middle, or we see them represented, and you see this all the time, these representations of the whirler in calligraphy, in art. Last night we were in a bookstore, and they were selling, Islamic decorative objects, and they also had like whirling guys. So they're no longer members of the Mevlevi Sufi tariqa, engaged in Devran, which is what this is actually called, during one of several aeens of the Mevlevi Sama. They become whirling dervishes. Many dervishes, and so in other words, what I'm trying to say is that when in their own context, this is a moment in a complex, lengthy ritual that they do, and they do many other things, and together, including eat, including probably iron those white outfits. But we take this as that moment. We don't even take the rest of their ritual as the moment, as what they do. This becomes elevated to what it means to be these people detached from its context, its musical context, all that sort of stuff. And also many other dervishes, many other Sufis actually whirl, they twirl around. This is a common practice in Sufism. But in the collective imagination, modern Mevlevis become the sole representatives of any such practice. So we kind of reduce Sufism to our image of what a good Sufi actually is. So, and this is not just this is a global phenomenon, which people have, parts do in many different ways. So even in Turkey, but also beyond Turkey, in the world everywhere, the Mevlevis and Rumi start becoming a symbol of kind of religious humanism in many different ways. And you'll see this everywhere. What you mean to say, it's, here's a cartoon of Rumi. So it's like Rumi sayings keep showing up in all kinds of places. So this is, life is a balance between holding on and letting go. Close quote, Rumi. Card, like a greeting card. Let the beauty we love be what we do. Rumi. So there you have these all sorts of things. But again, it's not, this is just, not to make fun of it particularly, but it's also something you find, but Turks do this too. This is done everywhere, because over there too, he's a picture of humanism. So there's a particular, again, I didn't bring the English, but I can translate it. So there's 4 lines of poetry by him that is really, really, really famous, and it's sort of like, so in Baza har anche hasti baza dar kafir o gabar o but parasti baza اگر این درگاه ما درگاه ناامیدی نیست 100 بار اگر توبه شکستی باز آ. So come back, whatever you are. So come, whoever you are. People have probably heard this if you read it in English. It's a very, very famous thing by him. So if you're a kafir, if you're a fire worshipper, if you're an idol worshipper, come back. This convent or this place of ours is not the place of hopelessness. So even if you've broken your vows 100 times, come back. Come. So this come, whoever you are, is a very famous line that's attributed to Rumi. The problem is, as this particular thing says, he never said this. Abu Sa'id Abul Khair, who's 250 years before him, who was a major Sufi figure from Khurasan, from what's now Afghanistan. He said this, again, when I'm thinking about this, so again, when you have, people, for example, who know Persian, and they also repeat this as a Rumi kind of thing, you figure, Abu Sa'id is an important poet, an important Sufi figure. You should know he said this. But no, this becomes famous as a Rumi thing, and it goes everywhere. And you hear it in English, and you actually have it in Turkish too. So in Turkey as well, they say this one, everywhere you go, there'll be gal. Gal means come in Turkish. So so what is this? Gal ne olursan ol yine gal. And there's a stencil graffiti from Istanbul of someone like, having this thing and gal on top. What I really like about this one is that you can actually see that someone kind of crayoned in an M-E after the gal. So it says gelmeh, which means don't come, in Turkish, because this is actually from a part of Istanbul. I took a photograph of this from where it's full of tourists. So basically, someone just wrote gelme, don't come, please. Anyway, so in any case, the fact is that even if Rumi had said these verses, one has to accommodate the possibility that poets express a variety of views that do not, in their decontextualized particularities, reflect their views in a comprehensive and sustained way. It doesn't take a substantial reading of Rumi's works to realize that he was strongly identified as a Muslim, and that particularly in clear distinction to various ways of being Christian. And I'm saying this because when you kind of embrace him saying, come, whoever you are, whatever you are, and it's like whether you're a fire worshipper, whether you're an idol worshipper, come. So the idea that we are open to everyone, it's nice as poetry, but that doesn't necessarily mean he believed that in every kind of way. And we know from the most reliable biography of him was written by this guy named Ahmad Aflaki, who was a disciple of his grandson, and of Rumi's grandson. And this is actually the most authoritative source of information on Rumi. And we know that Rumi, for example, he repeatedly gave excuses to the ruler of Konya, where he lived at that time. This is Sultan Qaykavus II. And he'd give excuses about why he wouldn't accompany the Sultan to his winter capital, which is Antalya on the Mediterranean coast. And he'd always say, I'm sick, I'm this, I'm an old man, all these sorts of things. But he told his own disciples that the reason he didn't want to ever go to Antalya was that it was full of kuffar, meaning it was a Christian city. So that was his, his attitude. It's interesting because, and if anyone's been to Antalya, it's full of Russian tourists today. So it's like, in a sense, not that different from what it was like back then, but from his perspective. So my point being that this is not to say he was a bad guy, because these kinds of attitudes of kind of communalism are very typical of people from that point in time. So it's not that he hated Christians or he was like this kind of, but it's that he was communally identified. And which is not surprising for someone who is a Muslim scholar in the 13th century. But we construct him as someone who was from another time and another attitude. That's kind of the issue. So even the Turks kind of assume frequently in their public imagination that he does all these things. And in fact, the Turkish state early on appropriated Rumi as an emblem of a universalistic Islam that the modern secular Republic of Turkey could unproblematically own. And I'll talk more about this in a minute, but before that I'm going to show you a few slides and a little bit about how this works. Meaning, Turkey needed, because Turkey was becoming a secular republic, they needed an Islam that they could comfortably promote as the happy Islam. And they very much participated in this. So what I'm going to do is show you slides from Rumi's main festival. So in Turco-Persian, Indo-Persian Islamic culture, a Sufi sheikh's festival is his or her death anniversary. And the word that's used for that is an urs. It's a wedding. Because it's the day that the person when they die is the day they're united with God. So it's celebrated as their wedding day in a sense. So it's called an urs, and in his case it's called Shab-e Urus, which is the night of the bride. So this is from 2015. The urs, this is Rumi's tomb in Konya. So this is the urs from 2015, and which is, I didn't go last year. I went to the one last year. I missed it. So it's held in Konya. It's observed everywhere in the country. And if anyone's ever been to Konya, where Rumi's tomb complex is actually now a controlled museum, in the sense that you have to get a ticket to go in. It has turnstiles. It's all these sorts of things. So it's very much kind of an enclosed museum atmosphere. Let me see if I can get this thing to work a bit. So in that corner you can see, so these are the outside, so this is actually a fence. So if you're walking on the sidewalk, this is what prevents you from getting in. There's a high wall, but you can see through the high wall. In any case, so it's held, people gather there, people come from all over. Aside from Turks, the vast number of people tend to be Iranians. The Iranians and the Turks behave differently while they're there. The Iranians actually come in groups. A lot of them come in like little group society, so they belong to groups with names like the Anjumane Dokhtorane Hafiz, which is the society of the daughters of Hafiz, and they'll come with their little. So in Iran, these are people who have these little reading groups where they read poetry and Sufi poetry, and they all come. They tend to be normally older ladies. And they come in these groups, and then they have little reading gatherings, and they have lectures held for them, and then they'll sit in the middle of the shrine, and this is the interior of the shrine. And right in front of us, you can't really see it because it's really a little dim. I mean, the camera's a bit dim, and the room's bright, but that's where his tomb is. And he died at some point in the afternoon, let's say 4:30, 4:15, I don't know, something like that. And you wait there all day. When you wait there all day, I normally don't wait there all day. I push my way to the front, and after arriving an hour before. But people wait there all day. They sit in little groups. The Iranians are always reading from the Masnavi in little circles. The Turks are talking on their phone with their moms, but again, so it's like on the one hand, there's a kind of it's a religious atmosphere, but it's also a festive atmosphere. So people are taking pictures with their phones. That one actually, she's with the sign next to her says men's section. And there are all kinds. This is Iranian ladies randomly she's wearing a scarf that has verses of Rumi on her. And very happy with wearing it, wanted a picture taken of this particular scarf. The point being, what I'm trying to get at is there's an element in which kind of religiosity and religious practice and tourism mix, and they blend. And this is not a remarkable thing, it's not a bad thing. Religious tourism and religion mixed together, but it's important to realize that in the modern world, meaning always, when you went on pilgrimage, let's say you went from, I don't know, someone went to Mecca, let's say, like thinking of places to go, but when people went and they traveled from a long distance to make a pilgrimage, and they do it today, but they probably brought souvenirs back. They had memories other than the memory of just going on the pilgrimage. So it's a complex thing, but people in the modern world, it gets more interesting. So here are two people. The woman is not as problematic. because she's actually fashionable. But the man, he was on my flight from Istanbul to Konya. He was not dressed that way, right? So he was dressed like a regular Iranian gentleman of his age and background, but he gets there and he puts on this outfit that no one wears in Iran. You don't behave as a Sufi today and dress this way. So it's costume, and I just give this as an example, that there's a particular way in which modern people then, in the process of coming to something like this, assume identities which are anachronistic to other behaviors. So meaning, this is not how he lives his life. I presume he's a Sufi, right? He does Sufi stuff every week. Thursday nights he does his practice. But he would not dress like this when he actually went in Iran to his gathering. He does this to come to Rumi's thing. So that's what I mean. There's a way in which it's not just that when you go, that tourism blends with religiosity. It's that it blends in a different way. You want to put on you are embracing an identity, embracing ideas about religion, about good religion that you wouldn't otherwise do. You would wonder, would this man ever dress as, the way, let's say, an Ayatollah in Iran dresses on another religious holiday? And I'm comfortable saying he never would. Because he wouldn't change out of his clothes like this and put that on, because in his mind, the associations would not be positive the way dressing in the Sufi outfit might be. Again, I'm speculating, but I'm suggesting. So, and again, in the process of all these sorts of things, again, tourism is just a very important part of this festival. I'm just showing these slides to give a sense of how these things actually work. So it's like we think about the great Rumi and how great it would be to be in Konya for his major festival, and it is great. But it's great in these combination of ways in which everyday modernity kind of blends with religious practice. So again, there's lots of tourist stuff everywhere. This is so in the foreground you actually have this huge. He doesn't turn, but it's just a huge statue of a guy, a Mevlevi. People come and pose next to it. But over here, this is a robot. This is a mechanical woman who is churning butter. As they don't sell butter, it's not a dairy shop, but it's just a way to attract people to come to their shop. So that lady's probably going to take her picture with him. People take all kinds of selfies. And just so you know, there's also, anyone know what that is? This is the front door. This is where you enter the tomb of Rumi from. Yeah. Somebody has their GoPro drone flying around on the day. This is like in a 3-day festival. This is the high point. Someone's GoPro drone is flying around above you, and the guy's standing there controlling his drone. So there's a way in which it's like, again, these things kind of blend together, and that's the way practice actually occurs. So in the case of Rumi, what has happened is that the state in Turkey has taken over the celebration of, or the ownership, in a sense, tried to own Rumi. It's become kind of an official function. So when his Shab-e Urus, his death anniversary, is a government event. The ceremony does not occur here. It does not occur at the Asatani, as it's at the place at his tomb. It occurs in a purpose-built stadium, which is called the Konya Cultural Center. And they hold those samahs, the whirling ceremonies. They hold them for 3 days, like several times a day. So you can go for the matinee, you can go for, the late night one. They hold these shows again and again and again. And I say this because Mevlevis themselves, traditionally, and they still exist, they don't do this. They hold one on an average week. They hold on Thursday night. And on that day, they hold them at night, but it's like it goes all evening. They sit around, they do something, they say their evening prayers, their night prayers, and then they start, and this goes on for hours and hours and hours. So the state takes it over. It's held in a ceremony. Government dignitaries give speeches. This particular time, the Prime Minister Erdogan, who's now the president, he was already president. So Erdogan gave a speech. He came and gave a speech. The Foreign Minister Davutoglu gave a speech. The governor of Konya province gave a speech. So in a 3-hour televised on Turkish state television event, half of it is speeches. It's then followed by a half-hour concert of classical Turkish music, and then there's 1 hour of Mevlevis actually doing their thing. And I'm just going to show you, it's a clip of less than a minute, just to give you a sense of how this is, because it's like I was going through this thing, this 3-hour ceremony, thinking, how can I kind of convey what it actually looks like? This is just to give you a sense of how it's domesticated within these other kind of public events. So hang on. Hopefully you'll be able to see it. This is not that. Okay. So what we have here is the Turkish master of ceremonies is the gentleman. Well, they're both Turks, but the gentleman speaks in Turkish and he tells you it's happening, and the lady does it in English and basically turn off your phones, but also hang on, sorry, like other sorts of things.
Yüzyıl Mevlevi bestekarlarından Kutbunayi Osman Dede'nin Rast Agil-i Şerifini icra edecek.
Okay, this is right after the concert has ended, the classical concert has ended, and he's saying right now, actually the Mevlevi part will begin. And he just told you that the musical group that accompanies the Mevlevis is being led by this famous conductor. So again, how does the Mevlevi zikr, their ceremony, get treated? It gets treated as not even mentioned with any individuality, but as kind of like, but here are the musicians, then here are these musicians, all these famous conductors. So,
Topluluğu huzurlarınıza davet ediyorum. Lütfen buyurunuz efendim.
So this is the Mevlevi Sheikh coming. So again, I don't know how clear it is to you, but I don't know if can you. So it's a stadium. Here again the lights are too bright. This, what he's walking on, is actually, it's like a basketball court, only it's round. It's purpose-built, so it's round, but it's like walking a basketball court. Those are seats going up all the way to the top. This is a stage, state-of-the-art kind of stage for the musicians. Can people see, or is it too bright? I'm going to pause it because it's kind of, sorry.
Much better. Yeah.
Much better, yeah, okay.
Yüzyıl Kutbunayi Osman diyeceklerdir. Topluluğu huzurlarınıza davet ediyorum. Lütfen buyurunuz efendim.
So now you can see it. So he. Okay, so what this man is actually doing is he's actually bringing out a sheepskin, a red sheepskin, which actually represents the head. Could we keep the lights down? I'm sorry. He's representing so they bring out a sheepskin, this red dyed sheepskin, which represents the sheikh of the order, and it's always put in one corner, and there's a circle, they make a circle and they put it in one corner to represent the sheikh himself, absent sheikh. But he brings it into this place, and then he puts it on top of, a very ordinary looking kilim. A very ordinary, which is not really part of doing it, but it's kind of like it's because what you're putting it down in the middle of what basically looks like a basketball court probably is a problem. But again, my point being that you take this and it becomes this kind of social spectacle which has been appropriated by the Turkish state. And when I say appropriated by the Turkish state, what happened again in Turkey is that again after the formation of the Turkish Republic as a secular republic, they actually created a department, not a Ministry of Religious Affairs, and they brought all religious functions under that. And they took the property, they usurped the property of independent religious organizations, and specifically of Sufi orders, because Sufi orders frequently have a lot of property. They own a lot of buildings, libraries, things like that. Those were brought underneath this ministry, this department, And so what that does is it makes everybody a functionary. Everyone who works, who's in or running a Sufi order, running a Sufi building, becomes a functionary of the state. So, and this is very obvious in many cases. So, for example, and in the Mevlevi case, the Rumi's followers, so all these things, they fall under, so they fall under the Ministry of Culture and Tourism, their buildings. So, in this particular case, the Mevlevis become a cultural phenomenon. They have that's why they perform in that particular context, and that's why even the average Turk would be fine with there being a classical concert and then a Mevlevi concert with dancing attached to it, because it becomes kind of a Turkish cultural event of aesthetic value with some religion thrown in. But what does religion mean in certain ways is not entirely clear. So this is something, so the state actually, and the way it's actually obvious how this works today, at exactly the same time this was going on. So the Prime Minister came, the President came for this particular festival in 2015 to Konya. And they're busy people, but they decided to come to Konya for this thing. And they held a rally in Selimiye Square. And Selimiye is a mosque. This oh god, I took it out. I took out the other slide, but basically it's right next to, it's wall to wall with Rumi's tomb. So at this big mosque, right in a square, right next to the tomb, the President and the Prime Minister hold a rally, complete with bussed-in party loyalists, buses and buses and buses of them. Well, what happens when you do something like that? Well, first of all, the streets get closed. So the streets aren't being closed for Rumi's festival, right? It's for the rally. So everyone who's going to the tomb in Konya, to Rumi's tomb, on Rumi's festival, has to go round and round and round and round to get in. And the main event for security, for everything becomes this particular rally. Now, is it accidental? No, it's not accidental. It's, there are many different reasons. It could be that they have a particular view of religion and of Turkish society where they don't actually want the Sufis to be prominent. But it's also a way in which what they're doing is they're taking Rumi and the Mevlevis and putting in within their notion of the Turkish state. Does that make any sense? So it's like a particular way of appropriating things. And this has a long history in which Rumi becomes a symbol of kind of Turkish good Islam, like the Islam we can export. In fact, the President's speech was all about, this is our culture, this is our religion, we love everyone, so on and so forth. So again, Rumi appears on their money. This is an old Turkish note, but it appears on Turkish money. There are commemorative stamps about Rumi and Mevlevis issued all the time. And and this is again, so like the good humanistic Islam against that institutionalized Ottoman Sufism that was gotten rid of to create the Turkish state, is how he gets juxtaposed. And to give you a sense of how this actually works, we see the fate of another group, about how these things actually work. So the other group in Turkey, which the Turkish Republic in the early years under Ataturk also treated as a humanistic form of Islam, was Turkish Alavism, which is different from Alawism in Syria and Lebanon. It's a different kind of being Alawi, so they were again seen as this. You could secularize them, and they became the public humanistic face of Islam under Ataturk. And you'll see in that particular case how this actually works for them was that if you look at this poster, so this is from a Cemevi. A Cemevi is a place where they come together to do worship, and so this is from some little Cemevi in a little village in northern Turkey, and this is their poster, so this is Haji Bektash, who's this big Sufi figure who is venerated by the Alevis in Turkey. So, and they have the Imam Ali on one side, and they have Ataturk on the other side, and both of them kind of looking towards Haji Bektash, right? So anyway, it's interesting how this, but again, this way in which religion gets kind of homologized. So it's Ataturk becomes a participant in being Alawi because Alawism becomes a participant in Ataturkism. So they're complete supporters, secular supporters of the secular state because as a minority they benefited from it. But even they then, just like the Mevlevis in Turkey are a cultural group, this particular poster has there's a little seal here, this little symbol over here, and what that symbol actually says, so the village's name is Gökçe Ağaç Köyü. So Gökçe Ağaç Köyü Kültür ve Yardımlaşma Derneği, which means, so it's this village, so Gökçe Ağaç, which is this place, it's Cultural and Social Aid Institute. What does that mean? Well, again, this is part of the Turkish model, that you actually become that they participate in this kind of that Sufi groups and religious groups secularize as part of the state. So what they really are doing is they're giving cultural and like societal aid and things like that, and not actually participating in anything else. So let me just sort of go on and this kind of how shifting back to the global. So I'll give an example again. So I'm going to give examples from Pakistan to show how this actually it can work in other places. So Rumi has nothing to do with Pakistan, except he's a great Persian Sufi poet, and there's a legacy of Persian literature in South Asia. So there's that. But this is actually the preliminary program of a conference on South Asian literature, South Asian Sufi literature, that I was at 10 days ago. And the picture they pick is of Mevlevis. Mevlevis have nothing to do with Pakistan. But again, because they become this kind of symbol of the happy Sufism that we'd like to believe in. Here's a calendar. They have the custom over there of, on New Year's, businesses give out calendars. So this is a business giving us this calendar, it's a graphic design business actually, and again, which is a Sufi one. So up there's Ishq up there, and it's about some Sufiana thing going on. But again, they put Mevlevis on there because again, for them it has nothing to do with their own society, but these things have become symbols of a good Islam. Now, I'm bringing up Pakistan because Pakistan is actually an excellent example of a country in which the state has tried to construct Sufism as the good form of Islam as a matter of modern policy. So Pakistan is a society with a lot of Sufi shrines in the country, and in fact, they're even modernizing orders. So 19th century forms of Sunnism. I don't actually have time to go into this in detail, but modernist forms of Sufism. Of Islam in South Asia are divided between the ones that actually approve of Sufi shrines and the ones who do not. And so it was decided, so very recently, that by the government decided about 30 years ago, let's say, that Sufism was the indigenous form of being Muslim, and they started promoting this kind of it as an aesthetic thing about music and love and light. So, again, Sufi dancing, devotional behavior, so on and so forth. And this has been done in this particular case, and I bring this as a case study because first the government, which had already, like Turkey, nationalized private religious entities and brought them under a department, in Pakistan's case, the Department of Awqaf, of religious affairs, of religious endowments. So everyone becomes a functionary, but they like these functions. They basically promote this because this is an Islam that they can control and present as a good Islam. Much more recently, and this is an important issue because it has, here it's a policy issue which has far-reaching consequences, which is that after 9/11 in particular, they were global kind of think tanks which were deciding how do we counteract Islamic radicalism, and they decided that Sufism was in fact the way to do it. So because this is the era of the Taliban that this was happening in, it focused very much on Pakistan and Afghanistan as if we can only promote Sufism, then all these Muslims will become nice people and we will counteract radicalism. And it was done very heavily in the case of Pakistan. So they promoted these sorts of ideas essentially promoting shrine culture, promoting ideas of Sufism, and in this kind of abstracted ways of doing things. So what I'm going to do is conclude on this particular note, and hopefully we can have more discussion about these issues in Q&A. But the point I'm trying to get at is the issue of modern and global Sufism. And what happens is that these things are often thought about first as kind of an imagined local Islam, as distinct from the international forms which are not attractive in the modern world, where they tend to be seen as ideological and political and with funding coming from abroad and all those sorts of things, as opposed to kind of the true way of being religious, which is nice and traditional and local or something like that. But then, so when you do that and you actually take it and make it a national religion, by which I mean, again, the Turkish example or the Pakistani example, what you're doing with Rumi, for example, in Turkey, is you're taking something which did not exist within state structures, and you're making it a national identity. When you take something that's local and you make it national as our own, it's actually no longer local. Why? Because nationals, there's no such thing as an authenticity, a local authenticity to a nation state. A nation state has probably in many ways more in common with the global, vis-a-vis at one village, one town, so on and so forth, than it does with, it's more kind of it's a large entity, very much like an international identity. And so what it actually does is all those things that you think are wrong about an international religious identity, which is ideological and political, all those come to play when you construct even Sufism as a national or a global identity. Meaning, if you think that coercion is a problem, they become coercive. The Sufi identity that's been promoted in Turkey, for example, with this particular thing, the government decides who a Mevlevi is. The government decides what legitimate Mevlevi practice is, and all those Mevlevis who are sitting there actually engaging in their Mevlevi practices themselves are not recognized by the state. They don't have access to the cultural center. They don't have access to the shrine. They can't do their ritual there either. So, and this is, and you can see this in forms elsewhere. You can see this in South Asia. You can see this in other parts of the world. So the point then being, I think, why does this happen? I think there are two levels, right? There's one is at the local level in these specific countries. There's the issue of why do people do this? And then there's the issue of the global. I think in specific countries, the reason why this move to kind of nationalize Sufism is it's a search for some sort of national authenticity. And I hate using the word authenticity, it's an overused word. But what I'm trying to say is that I think these are, in my opinion, they're one reaction to what I call epistemic colonization. And by that, often you hear about colonization of the mind. I don't mean colonization of the mind, but it's colonization of systems of knowing, systems of knowledge. So when we actually, what happens in a lot of post-colonial, in the sense of ex-colony societies, is that people are concerned with colonialism, but often, and this is both in the case of Turkey and in Pakistan, it's not that they're concerned with socioeconomic colonialism, they're concerned with the fact that whether they think right or not, whether we're thinking, whether our thought processes, whether our knowledge traditions, all of those things are ours, or did we get them from somewhere else? And you see this played out, actually. So one is, it's not just about the British or the French or whatever, but it's also in the modern world about the current powerful countries in the Islamic world who have the ability to export their ideologies because of their financial means and so on and so forth. So the idea is, are we, again, to give an example, the example in Turkey and Pakistan would be of Saudi Arabia. So they'd actually say, well, this other kind, so they'll say, that Islam, the one we don't like, it's foreign. The Saudis are paying for it and they're bringing it to our country. We were never like this. So it's that and if we got rid of that, we think, if we thought the way we always used to think, if we do things the way we always used to think, we'd be good Muslims and things would be better. And what is that? That ends up being a Sufi identity. And I think this particular issue, so this is the way it actually works in many Islamic societies. In my opinion, actually, this quest for kind of trueness to who you actually are. In some ways, this is also the same thing. One could argue it's done differently, but with Sufism, this is also what New Age religion is about in many ways. So the Rumi that we see, that we all love, kind of as the Rumi of the greeting card, the Rumi of the cartoon, the Rumi of the what if Rumi was a politician and a lawgiver? Well, that Rumi is also in a sense for people, because there's this kind of disenchantment that people actually have with the presence that they face themselves with, that they're faced with, that they inhabit, their globalized modernities that they actually have to inhabit, and they see an embracing of this kind of an identity, this imagined pleasant identity, as a much more palatable way to actually be. The question I have, and I'll not answer this question, I realize this is a very, very dissatisfactory way to end a presentation, but I wonder if this is actually ultimately futile. And what I mean to say is that this kind of trying to create or embrace an imagined pleasant identity, because it might not work, because I don't think it's possible to actually ideologically construct identities. Not at an individual and a collective level. And particularly at a collective level, the moment you start trying to construct identity, like when states actually try and tell you who you are, it never ends well. So I just wonder if you can do it differently with Rumi, if he was a lawgiver. And on that note, I'll stop.
Thank you, Jamal, for this humorous, on-time, rich, سهل الممتنع type of lecture. I have many comments, actually. But I believe we have a few minutes for questions, and I will start with the questions of the audience.
I realize a lot of people are saying, I feel cheated. We were going to talk about Rumi.
Bashar.
On the success of this project, why do you think, I share your skepticism about the project, but many communities are the substance of nationalism, which is usually supported also by some level of centralized or semi-centralized. So myths can be propagated in the center and then become local events. It doesn't only grow from the local upwards. So is it the fact that this kind of nationalism is a kind of a touristic nationalism? It doesn't have a soul in that sense. It's something, it's a promotional nationalism rather than coming out of a need of the political elite.
I think that's a very good question. I agree. It's like, yeah, I think that, in my opinion, actually what it is it's promotional, but it's in the sense that the elites don't believe in it. Yeah, they don't believe in it. So it's the idea, we want a happy Islam, this is the happiest. We don't want Taliban, right? Let's turn them into these kind of Sufis, and these people don't actually know what it is. So, and you actually, when you hear the vocabulary, and both in Turkey when these people make speeches, and the government makes speeches, or in Pakistan where it's really been a policy issue, so you have documentation after documentation about this, they never use the words for Sufism that the practicing Sufis ever use. So it's like they're at 10,000 meters in a plane looking at actually how Sufis behave, and they call it by kind of the terminology that gets used in books about Sufis. So again, in Pakistan, for example, they always use the word Sufism, even though the word in the society is tasawwuf, right? But they always use the word Sufism. And in Turkey also, they use the word Sufi. They don't use the word tasawwuf. I don't know, because again, I think they're being informed by kind of a global political discourse, and they don't actually connect it to things that happen in their society. Turkey is not as bad in this because they're so weak in this particular group, and the Mevlevis are just basically trying to. There's competition between, so their institutions got nationalized, and their institutions get given away in kind of crony benefactor kind of models to other groups in the Turkish state, and so the Mevlevis themselves kind of survive in holes in the corner. It's a complex thing. In Pakistan's case. There's a lot of competition between Sufi groups about getting access to the state. You actually see this replicated in the US. So in the US, there's a particular Naqshbandi group which has been embraced by the US government as the good Islam, and there's Hisham Kabbani is the head of that particular group. They get enormous benefits relative to other Sufi groups who are completely ignored.
You were talking about Sufism in contrast with the other groups that are, we see these days, the extreme believers. Do you think there exists another identity in between that is more realistic than Sufi figure and
I think there are many identities, and I don't think they're in between. I think, the kind of like in a lot of cases, again, it sounds stupid to say, and I mean, I'm not a political scientist, I never pretend to be one, but I don't have to answer policy questions in my life, which is, I'm lucky. But basically, I'm sure most people in this room would agree with me that, I don't really care about people's religious identities, in the sense that what I care is that they don't go around killing and beating up other people. And if we can all kind of agree on that kind of a baseline, that you can have a conversation without killing the other person, I'm happy with you believing your whatever you believe. You see what I'm trying to say? And I'm not being facetious, I'm not being flippant. But, so the notion of something in between or something else, it's not necessarily in between. It's not in between, I'm just, again, in a lot of these cases, a lot of the highly conservative people of a particular kind, they're not violent. They're not politicized. And similarly, all Sufis are not nice people. Or non-organized or non-violent. Far from that. So the issue, from my perspective, and I know this is naive, but this is actually a secular point of view, is that, it's the basic agreement that they should live in some environment, whatever it means in a particular context, of kind of liberal behavior, which means you tolerate the other person. And beyond that, I don't have a spectrum to say who's conservative, who's not conservative, because it's not my business. That people, because you see this in the Islamic world in modernity, and one of the critiques of Sufism in the 19th century from the British and from Islamic groups, reformist groups, has been that these people promote social ills and superstition. This has been the critique of Sufism, because it's organized underneath charismatic leaders that you don't question. The charismatic leaders obviously encourage a system like that. Things like that. So you could say, so a lot of what's happened also is there's a straight trajectory from the 19th century in particular of the modernizing Sunni groups, particularly the Sunni groups, a lot of them. Those very modernizing groups led into a lot of the militant groups of the end of the 20th century and the beginning of the 20th. So the Taliban have a direct trajectory to what's called the Deobandi school, and the Deobandi school was very much a modernizing school in the 19th century and the first half of the 20th century. So meaning this notion of there's this versus that. What I'm trying to say is that it's their behaviors that I think are unacceptable. That perhaps if we could focus on that and get people to agree that we shouldn't beat up on each other, the world would be a better place. And then
It doesn't have to be another group with this.
I don't, in my opinion, I don't think so. I don't think so. But again, as I said, I'm not a political scientist. I'm just wishfully thinking about these things, right? Yeah. One and then two. Yeah.
Okay, so my question is about, to what extent do you think the promotion of Sufism or Rumi as a figure in Turkey is related to the fact that Sufism is known to be apolitical, is known to be, they're more like either Sufism Ma'rifi or Sufism, just they don't get into the politics. To what extent do you think the Turkish government is trying to say this is the best kind of religion that one can have? Don't you think that is sort of thinking on your behalf?
Well, so the very reason why the Turkish government supported the Mevlevis and not some other Sufi group is precisely because the others were more political. So meaning, in fact, Sufis are frequently very political. And in the Islamized, kind of the arc of Islamization of Turkish politics, so Turgut Özal, who was in the basically 90s, was the first prime minister who was overtly from a religious party. Turgut Özal was a practicing Naqshbandi. So it's not that they are not political. And also even the Mevlevis, and I've always found this is kind of like a Monty Python skit almost. The Mevlevis sent a regiment to fight for the caliphate in the First World War. So I just kind of imagine these guys dressed in their Mevlevi outfits kind of going to battle against the German, no, not the Germans, against the French or against the British. It just sounds almost like a skit. So yeah, they're always political. So I think the promotion is the notion that they want to be political, but that doesn't really mean anything. I think you support those ones who are not political. But then if you support ones who are not political and then you give them political benefits and financial benefits, they're in the political system. And again, in a country like Turkey, for example, yes, if you're in Istanbul, it looks different. So essentially it's corporate. You bribe them. But if you're talking about in the Kurdish parts of Turkey, for example, which is still very feudal, a lot of the feudal system is connected with Sufism. So when you actually give benefits to the elites to actually side with the state, all these things come into play because all the aghas they're frequently essentially Sufi figures. They come from hereditary Sufi families. Yeah. And there was a question there.
Yeah, I think my question just got answered. I was just going to ask if you could give. I know it's a very broad question, but you said that Sufism is not a violent. Is far from being a non-violent movement, and I was just wondering if you could give a couple of examples.
So just generally speaking. When you think about it, one of the social characteristics of Sufism through Islamic history is that it's a tight organizational structure. Each Sufi group is a tight organization, in which there are oaths of loyalty, often unquestioning loyalty, things like that, and they tend to have independent systems of authority relative to the state. So you find that Sufi orders have historically, for example, in the colonial period, a lot of anti-colonial agitation, military agitation occurred through Sufi orders. True in North Africa, true in the Middle East. So that's one thing. True in the Caucasus, true in South Asia. I mean, you can go. So you see kind of Sufi organization because they lend themselves to being organized structures to begin with. Sudan, and in fact, a lot of the ruling rooms. And then if you go back in time, I mean, it's like. The most famous dynasty of Iran is the Safavid dynasty. Well, they're named for being a Sufi order. They are the followers of Sheikh Safiuddin Ardabili. They took their name from the fact that they're actually a Sufi order, but they were a military order, right? So there are all kinds of things. There's similarly the Alavis in Turkey, the Bektashis, who were the origins of the Alavis are kind of pseudo-Bektashis because Bektashis are gone. The Bektashism was the Sufi identity of the Janissary Corps of the Ottoman army. They all belonged to because again, to get people to have a kind of take oaths of allegiance to one person is a great thing in the military. Right? So what I'm suggesting again, it comes back to it doesn't mean that they're violent and therefore they're bad, but they're not necessarily non-violent. Yeah.
Just like
any other group, exactly, and yeah.
It's a historical question
Sure.
to religious violence, actually. So I remember reading your book on Simnani, and you talk about how he embraced exoteric jihad.
Yes.
And I think much the same can be said of Ibn Arabi. While he lived in Malatya, he wrote a letter to Sultan Qaybus.
Yeah.
To jihad against the infidel. So the questions are two parts. Does Rumi express, when you talked about his attitude to kuffar, does he express anything related
It's a good question.
Jihad? He's living on the frontier.
He's not living on the frontier. That's the thing. Anyway, keep going. Finish your question.
Well,
yeah.
And if so, how have these New Age movements attempted to reconcile it, or have they simply ignored it completely?
That's, I think, the second part is a good question. I mean, so the historicity gets ignored.
Yeah.
That's what happens. And regardless of...
Can we hear the question again?
So the question was about how a lot of, in the period, essentially the period that Rumi was alive, a little before, a little after, two people he mentioned, one from Iran and one from Ibn Arabi, who lived in Anatolia in Syria and Anatolia for much of his later life. that these people they advocated jihad and things like that. And did Rumi actually do this? And because he also lived essentially in the Anatolian frontier, which is a frontier in the sense of the meaning. Yeah. So, I mean, the answer is, well, I mean, it's a good question, because even if he didn't live on the frontier, the question is valid because Simnani did not live on a frontier.
No.
Yeah. So, no, he didn't that much. He didn't. But we don't have many of his writings that are actually of that sort. His letters, the letters that are preserved of him, are basically letters written to government officials to get jobs or concessions for his sons-in-law. So those are the letters we actually see. He didn't advocate jihad, but he didn't actually politically involve himself with anyone except with the Anatolian Seljuk state. And I think when he was alive, for example, Trabzon was already under Muslim control, which means that the border was now actually with Georgia, you know. And maybe he didn't feel he lived in a frontier state. His orbit was much more towards south, and there was no jihad south from Konya, right, at that point in time. So yeah, but it's a good question. I'm trying to think about it. You don't see that in that, and it's they are. I mean, there's no doubt that Rumi and more so his followers, early followers, are different from many other orders. I think they've been brought into a normalized notion of all Sufi orders looking the same, and they don't. Like his grandson, Ulu Arif Chalabi. This is a guy, you know, it's like, so the Mevlevis, Rumi was he looked like a good Muslim religious figure, right? He wore a big robe and he had a big beard and all those sorts of things. His grandson was Akhfash. He had shaved all his facial hair. So he had no eyebrows, he had no eyelashes, he had no beard, no nothing. This is something that actually you find among particular kinds of religious people, Sufis, in this part of the world. And it's kind of a very striking way of looking, but the idea is that, you know, your face shines with the glory of God. So he was very different from his grandfather, and there are these stories, and there are no contradicting stories because we have no idea about this, but he used to travel to various places all through Anatolia into up to the Georgian frontier, actually. So in these very Christian areas, and he'd go up to people and he'd go to a monastery, and there again, a lot of these are miracle stories, but there are no other versions of the story. And he would go into a monastery, he'd go into a Sufi center, and they'd look at him and they'd say, okay, we're going to start following you. And beginning, there are no mechanism. We know there was no army to go with him. It's not obvious why all these Sufi centers actually joined him. You know, it's like this guy shows up. He worked a lot of miracles. That's what the story tells us. And a lot of his miracles are very Christian miracles, which is very cool. But they are different. There's no mention, and like you never hear about him calling up, meaning writing a letter to the local Muslim ruler and saying, go attack that little village. Instead, he shows up, goes drinking with the local, the abbot of the monastery, and next thing you know, they've turned Muslim, which is in itself interesting.
Okay, if there are no more questions, I'll ask my questions.
No, it's difficult.
No. Feel free to answer one of them. There are two. The first question is related to the collective authorship of Rumi. You started with that, right? And of course, collective authorship is very common in the Arab-Muslim civilization. So Majnun Layla is a collective authorship. Even the earliest source says, probably he never existed. Khayyam, of course, in Persian, collective authorship, and Rumi is collective authorship. But they choose the figure of Majnun Layla because most probably, yes, he was the best of these poets who talked about love. Same with Khayyam, for example. So to what extent there is really substance in Rumi's poetry that made him the choice of the Turkish government? And not that because he was the least political, but because, of course, the Mawlavi order is already a construction. Because Rumi was anti-tariqa from right, to some extent, at least. the Mawlavi order has nothing to do, of course.
Yeah, that's well,
with-
yeah,
with-
yeah, yeah,
with
yeah,
Rumi.
yeah, yeah.
So they went back, not to the Mawlavi order, not to the construction, but to Rumi, because they focus actually on Rumi, not on the order,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
So what the question is, to what extent there is really substance in Rumi's poetry that made him so special?
Well, I think there are two parts to that. One is they also do focus on the Mevlevi order. A lot of it is, it's about the whirling guys. Whirling becomes the symbol of being a Sufi. So that whenever in Turkey you go to any cafe in the tourist area and they have a guy whirling in the corner. But it becomes kind of a symbol of Turkish identity in certain ways. So it's not just true. But I think for them, in Turkey's case, it's because he's from there. They own him, and that's the attitude. They own him, and so meaning he lived his life in Konya. He wasn't born there, but he lived his life in Konya. So he's actually, of all the classical great Sufi Persian poets, he's the one who comes from Turkey, and he is a big deal. He's I think what is the reason? I don't know why Rumi is the most popular, was historically the most popular Sufi poet. I think, again, people get very offended when you actually talk about these things analytically, because how dare you criticize Rumi? But I mean, the fact of the matter is, in Persian, there's the high pantheon of Persian poets, and among them, he's the only one who's a prolific Sufi poet. And there's a reason why he's there. I think it's because he's a Persian poet. But I'm not a scholar of Persian poetry at that level that I'm going to pass judgment on the quality of poets from the medieval period. So I think there's that. But the interesting thing about Turks is that Turks don't know Persian. And they haven't known Persian for 500 years. Educated Turks have not known Persian, by and large, unless they learnt it specifically, for 500 years. So they read him in translation. So at some level, it would be exactly the same as people in Lebanon deciding that they love Rumi, right? Except because it's part of their state. I mean, and the thing is, it was embraced by the Turkish aristocracy as a Sufi order, because it's very closely tied to high culture. So in the emergence of Ottoman high culture, they've replaced Persian with Turkish, but they still sort of sit around sipping espressos and listening to music, or whatever you did in the 19th century. You drank sherbet and listened to music, right? And I think that's where this actually comes in.
The other question is about the national identity. Right? To what extent, because you go frequently to Turkey, you've lived there for
A long time, yes,
for a long time.
Yeah.
So to what extent Rumi is truly popular among the Sufis, at least, or among the population in Turkey? Because if you go, for example, of course, the Naqshbandis, the Qadiris, many Sufi orders. You go, for example, to Trabzon, you don't see Mawlavis much in Trabzon now, right? So to what extent this is actually touristic and a message to the international community, because Rumi is so popular in the West as well? So
I think there are two things. The Mevlevis they're still there. The fact is they were never that popular. It's my feeling, and I can't back this up. I mean, I'm trying to do research on it, but it'll never happen. Is that the Mevlevis have suffered greatly. A lot of other Turkish orders have survived and thrived in the modern period, and the Mevlevis have not. And my guess is because the Mevlevis were too close to the state, and they need to be close to the state for a couple of reasons. So meaning, when they lost sponsorship, they essentially had to start dying out. And I think the reason is that, unlike other Sufi orders, most Sufi orders can have their ritual, their zikr, occur in the house of a rich person, basically. Like you just find their living room, they set up their basements. It's so common everywhere that, a room is set up in the house of some prominent person, and that's where everyone goes for zikr. But the Mevlevis need a place, they need a dance hall, right? And you don't have them traditionally in people's homes. So they need spaces that require public patronage. And I think when those places get taken away, they tend to suffer. There are Mevlevis everywhere.
So the Turks do buy these statues?
Everywhere.
Or is it for the tourists?
Turks buy these statues.
They buy them as well.
Of course they buy these statues. But it's fascinating. It's like I've been there. So it's like when you go to the public ones, so it's interesting because there's a space between the private Mevlevi behavior and the public Mevlevi, the state Mevlevi behavior. There's kind of the state pub. So it's like on various, like, on the Prophet's birthday or Laylatul Qadr or something, there'll be the thing held, but it's held at the shrine. And then all these Turkish families show up, and that's the best part of all this. I really love, that's the fun part, because all these families sitting there and they're all eating, pumpkin seeds and talking on their phone, and then they set up the little stage and little children run across and pick up the skin, and the skin's taken, then they come back and the skin gets put back, and people are talking, and it's like, what do you expect happens when they're doing their zikr? Everyone's there, with their phone taking videos of these people. And then at the end of it, so the Mevlevi ceremony ends with a bunch of prayers on major Muslim figures, and they say prayers on, they'll say prayers on the Prophet, prayers on, and it's, Ameen, everyone. Prayers on Imam Ali, Ameen. Prayers on the house of the Prophet, Ameen. Prayers on the 12 Imams, Ameen. Prayers on the Shuhada, basically suddenly turns into this totally Shia thing. Everyone in the audience is a Sunni, and you're going, are you even paying attention as you do your pumpkin seed thing? And I'm not trying to, again, there are Sunnis very commonly in many parts of the world are very imam friendly. So that's not actually a big problem. Historically in Turco-Persian Sufism, this is very common. But in modern Turkey, their identities are very constructed in modern kind of notions of what is it to be a Sunni, what is it to be a Sunni. So still they're like going da da da, and this is the space it occupies.
I want to announce two things, actually three things. The lecture will be online in a week, so you can share it with your friends. I want to announce also that on Tuesday, May 2nd, we have a panel on this book, هذه اللغة الشريفة. It's at 5 in the Islam Faris Institute. May 4 to 6, we have a Khamriya conference, the wine poem, in Arabic, Persian, and Turkish. It's a big conference. You're welcome to attend. And finally, please join me in thanking Professor Jamal Elias.
Thank you.